Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live, in-person and online program titled Empress San Francisco, the Pacific Rim, the Great West, and California at the Panama-Pacific International Exposition. And thank you again for joining us here at the Book Club and in the virtual world. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome everyone and host the program this evening. For those of you that might be new to the Book Club of California, we are a nonprofit member and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the history and the literature of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition, finely made books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, California history, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a member of the book club, or if your membership has lapsed and you are interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest and the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the book club without the support of our members. So I encourage you to go online to bccbooks.org to learn more about the book club or to join. And now for tonight's program and our presenter. The program is titled Empress San Francisco, the Pacific Rim, the Great West, and California at the Panama-Pacific International Exposition. And the presentation is by author and professor of history at Carroll University, Abigail Markwyn. Santa Rosa native Abigail Markwyn is a professor of history at Carroll University in Waukesha, Wisconsin. That should be the word that I have a problem saying. Her areas of specialty are gender and race in the United States, American Indian history, Western United States history, California history, the history of World's Fairs, and Latin America. She is the co-editor of Gendering the Fair, Histories of Women and Gender at World's Fairs, and her book, Empress San Francisco, the Pacific Rim, the Great West, and California at the Panama-Pacific International Exposition, from University of Nebraska Press, is her latest book, published in 2014. She has written numerous other articles and book chapters on her areas of research. Now tonight, Abigail will talk about the book. I won't read the title again. When more than 18 million visitors poured into the Panama-Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco in 1915, they encountered a vision of California and the world born out of San Francisco's political and social climate. The P.P.I.E. encapsulated the social and political tensions and conflicts of pre-World War I California and presaged the emergence of the city as a cosmopolitan, cultural, and economic center of the Pacific Rim. Tonight, Abigail will examine, in her book, Abigail examines one of the largest and most influential World's Fairs by considering the social and political climate of progressive era San Francisco. I think tonight she's also going to talk about or touch upon her current project, which is on the 1939 Golden Gate International Exposition. She'll also comment, I think, on how the digitization of sources like newspapers has changed her approach to her work. So in terms of logistics for tonight, we will have a presentation and we'll follow that with a Q&A session. If you have questions for our speaker, please hold them to the end. We will have time at the end of the presentation to take questions, and we'll do that from folks here in the club rooms and also from our audience on Zoom. And you can use the chat and the Q&A in Zoom to pose your questions and post your comments. I'll be back at the end to help do the Q&A session. And now it's my great pleasure to go see if I can fix our Wi-Fi and introduce our speaker, Abigail Markwyn.
All right. Wow. I'm not going to say the title of my talk again. I think we know. Actually, for a long time, I've had to look at the title to remember exactly the order in which I put it in. So periodically I have to like Google it to remind myself if I can't find a copy of my CD so that I remember exactly what it says. But this is the book. Anyway, good evening. Thank you all for coming hear my talk tonight. And thank you particularly to the Book Club of California for hosting me. Thank you very much to Kevin Kosick for organizing the event and to Terry Castaneda for connecting me to the book club itself. I'm really happy to be here to talk about a subject that is near and dear to my heart, the 1915 Panama-Pacific International Exposition. Now, given the sound issues, how am I doing in the back? Good? Okay, excellent. All right. So I'm here to talk about my book, but it's now 2024. So my book is almost 10 years old, which means that maybe some of you have read it. And it's reasonable for me to have a few more things to say than simply reiterating the findings of the book. Thus, I'm going to end my talk with some gesturing towards thinking about the ways in which the PPIE is connected to my current project, which is on the 1939 Golden Gate International Exposition. So just to warn you that is coming up. So I did start my work on the fair over 20 years ago because it was my dissertation. It's hard to admit that. And I came to the topic actually for a number of reasons. But I remember that I first came up with the idea I went to an exhibit here in San Francisco, and I think it was at the Museum of Modern Art. It might have been the de Young right before it closed. That to move. Anyway, it compared the city's three expositions, the 1894, the PPIE, and the GGIE, and it was a small thing, but I was looking for a dissertation topic. And so I thought, oh, I can compare race and gender at all three fairs. Needless to say, that was huge. And as I started to look into it, I realized that topic was huge. But more importantly, I figured out that the archives on the PPIE are themselves huge, and at that time were very underutilized. I think there's been a lot more work on the PPIE now, but there's a lot of information there. So I ended up focusing just on one fair for the dissertation and then the book. So now, 2 decades later, after life and a pandemic and children and all those things, I am thinking about I've been turning to the 39 fair with my research for a while, but I'm trying to think a little bit more deeply about the relationship between the two fairs. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But first, this is the PPIE. Oh yeah, that's appropriate response. So it opened in February of 1915 and closed on December 4th of 1915. During that time, almost 19 million visitors poured through its gates to wander around the 635-acre site, where 70,000 exhibits were arranged along 50 miles of aisles in dozens of individual buildings. You can see there's huge exhibit palaces where exhibiting nations and companies presented the newest technology and products took center stage. The formal palaces were designed in a stately and formal modified Beaux-Arts style, which was blended with regional influences in what boosters termed, quote, Oriental details, laid out in a court plan with statuary in every possible nook and cranny. And you can get a sense of the sort of standardization of the site here. And also you can imagine just how much statuary is hiding in all of those alcoves. Officially, the fair celebrated the completion of the Panama Canal and the 400th anniversary of Vasco Nunez de Balboa's sighting of the Pacific Ocean, thus the Panama and the Pacific in its title. But for San Franciscans, the event was also about celebrating the city's recovery from the 1906 earthquake and fire and claiming the city's status as the preeminent city of the West Coast. Boosters hoped that it would bring tourists, business, and settlers to California. City leaders staged the Panama-Pacific to boost their city's economic prospects. As San Francisco department store magnate Reuben Brooks Hale stated when he first proposed the fair, interestingly, in 1904, before the earthquake, so the idea did come before, he said, quote, "It should be advertised as the opening of San Francisco as the center of trade for the Pacific Ocean. or in commemoration of the completion of the Panama Canal, since San Francisco was, in his words, the beginning of the East and the ending of the West. As they moved forward in planning the fair, officials chose to limit all exhibits to products of the last 10 years, making it a celebration of progress, in quotation marks, or as the official guidebook put it, an epitome of civilization. Now, this is that was my dissertation title. It wasn't as catchy as they didn't like that for the book. So this is a map. I apologize. Those of you on Zoom can probably see it fairly well. It didn't come through quite as well through the projector, but you just get a sense of the scope. This is, of course, the Marina District. So that's the bay up at the top. You've got Fort Mason over there. And it was a huge site. This part over here was what was called the Joy Zone, i.e. the Midway. But that was the entertainment section. And then you have the palaces and state buildings and national buildings as well. So this emphasis on progress and civilization meant that fair visitors encountered a world dominated by US interests based on the tenets of scientific racism and social Darwinism. The official narrative, conveyed by the statuary, artwork, and publicity of the fair, created a vision of California history, US society, and the US relationship to the Pacific and Latin America that posited a dichotomy between primitive and civilized, both of those in quotation marks, please, cultures and nations. Much of the artwork and exhibits reflected popular theories of social evolution and the dominance of white men while reinforcing eugenic ideas about social progress and racial purity. The official guidebook noted that the sculpture helped tell the fair's overarching story of the, quote, achievement and great triumph of the United States in completing the Panama Canal. This is the column of progress, and this is the adventurous bowman, which is the statue that was atop the column of progress. It is a half-clothed man shooting an arrow surrounded by a circle of toilers and a patient female figure. In the back. Another prominent sculpture was the Fountain of Energy, where another male figure was astride a horse tearing through the water in what the sculptor described as a, quote, joyous aquatic triumph, celebrating the completion of the Panama Canal. This was also eugenics underlay a lot of the fair. This was the race betterment booth that occupied a prominent place, and I believe it was the Palace of Liberal Arts, which also is just important to understanding the driving principles of much of the fair. However, there is a lot more to World's Fairs, I would argue, than their official exhibits and narratives. Although I'm not arguing that we should dismiss the power of the reams of publicity and propaganda that rolled out of the PPIE's offices on Market Street, it is essential to pay attention to the other voices that competed for the attention of fairgoers. Local residents eagerly anticipated the coming of the fair and participated in it in multiple ways. These are just a few snapshots, actually, of some examples of local residents participating in the fair and some of the events that occurred at the fair and before the fair. We have Chinese children riding in the Insurance Day Parade up there in the top left. This is the German Day Parade in the top right. The dedication of the YWCA building, that was before the building was actually constructed. And then this is the women's suffrage booth. So I'm not going to talk about the suffragists today, but that's another important piece of my book, is talking about the way that women's suffrage staged a presence at the fair, because California was a state that had just in 1911 awarded women suffrage. Yes, indeed, it's Women's History Month, isn't it? So hang on. So that's where I get to explaining a little bit more about my book and my approach to the fair. My project differentiated itself from other works on the fair because I'm interested in how local politics shape the fair and at looking at the fair to some extent from the bottom up rather than the top down. My underlying argument in the book is that local priorities and conflicts shaped the fair. countering assertions that World's Fairs served primarily as vehicles of national and international political and social agendas. Instead, I would argue the case of the PPIE reveals that local context mattered a great deal. So I'm going to just share a few of these stories today. There's a lot more in the book. I'll talk about this in a second. First, let's talk about the money. To convince the federal government to award San Francisco the right to host a World's Fair in 1915, San Franciscans promised to fund the fair themselves without any federal assistance. Like, that was a key part of the argument that San Francisco made to win the fair. They were in a contest, a heated contest finally with New Orleans. Previous fairs relied on federal funds, so this was an audacious move by city leaders desperate to win the right to the fair. This meant that fair officials, I argue, were particularly attuned to engaging the public in support of the fair and in making it appear to be an event that belonged to all of San Francisco. They just thus took care in their negotiations with local leaders and tried not to offend powerful constituents. One of the strategies that they used to keep local residents engaged in the fair was reaching out to local ethnic communities, such as the Swedes. And they formed official auxiliary groups to the exposition, whose official charge was to encourage participation in the fair, both community, like city and statewide participation, but also to try to encourage the national government of their ancestral homeland, whatever term we want to use for that, to also participate in the fair. There were 16 of these groups that eventually functioned, and generally prominent professional men were the core of those groups. The most active groups included German American, British American, Finn American, Swedish American, Italian Americans, and Dutch Americans. Their involvement varied, but their activities included hosting events for visiting officials, sending letters and telegrams to friends and relatives to convince them to support their nation's participation in the fair, and raising money to support, to stage events at the fair. Other members were asked to travel with official fair delegations abroad to visit their homelands. So delegations were actually sent to Finland, Greece, Norway, Portugal, Spain, Switzerland, and Serbia. Now, if you remember, the fair started in 1915. Serbia was not a participant. The war was going on. World War I had started. Not all were successful. Only Greece, Norway, and Portugal and Switzerland actually committed to participation. And obviously, World War I is underlying the entire event. I can talk more about that, but that's obviously an important piece of what's going on anytime we talk about the fair. So what I want you to think about is the extent to which these activities demonstrate the depth of commitment from citizens in the city who had their own economic interests, but to trying to encourage their home nations or ancestral nations to participate in the fair and to represent themselves at the fair. So some of the letters that that residents wrote to the fair help reveal some of the hopes of these groups. So local Welsh residents organized to bring a huge, and I'm sorry, I don't speak Welsh, Eisteddfod, which is a traditional celebration of Welsh music and poetry that dated to medieval times, to the fair, because they believed it would be, quote, in the best interests of the Welsh people to preserve and perpetuate its traditions, literature, music, customs, and language. Letters poured into the exposition office from supporters of the idea both in the US and Wales. So I think it was pretty clear. Exposition officials no doubt perceived this as an advertisement to draw visitors, but for those of Welsh heritage, they saw it as something quite different. There were many special days at the fair, just to explain that. Every day was like 5 different special days. So it might be like Insurance Day and Sweden Day and Alameda County Day and the General Federation of Women's Clubs days, right? They might all be sharing a day at the fair. And what that meant is that all of these groups would stage various celebrations, parades, or ceremonies, pageants, all kinds of different things at the fair to celebrate whatever their identity or affiliation was that they were celebrating. And so this is an example of Sweden Day at the fair. And I just really love this quote. So at the dedication of the Swedish pavilion at the fair, the local Swedish paper reported that, quote, there was no one in the crowd who, quote, did not feel the indescribable joy of having the privilege of being Swedish. So the fair offered many different ethnic communities ways to affirm their own ethnic identity and to proclaim it to a much larger audience than they might find anywhere else. So this and other examples are part of my argument that we can understand the fair as a site for the construction of racial, ethnic, and religious identities, because it offered local and national groups ways to create their own spectacles that they displayed to fairgoers. And not only were those spectacles visible to anybody at the fair, but they were also reported on by newspapers. And this is an era where there were multiple city newspapers, people got multiple newspapers a day, and the articles were also, sent to out of San Francisco, right, to other newspapers around the city, around the state, around the country. So part of my argument is that a lot of these ideas get filtered out of the fairgrounds because people can actually encounter them through the newspapers, right? So they can read about the events even if they didn't actually attend the events themselves. So, excuse me. Most of the local communities that were involved in the exposition seem to have experienced little conflict. However, some local groups, not surprisingly, did experience some pretty significant debates around their participation in the fair. And it's those issues I want to turn to now, for they demonstrate both the significance that local communities placed on the fair and the ways that the Bay Area's local political and social culture shaped the vision of society that greeted fair goers. The conflicts and debates that surrounded the participation and representation of the nations of China and Japan at the fair offer a clear example of the confluence of regional, national, and international interests and priorities on the fairgrounds. The irony of an exposition that celebrated the Pacific world and sought to expand trade relations with Asia, occurring in 1915, just 2 years after California passed a law banning aliens ineligible for citizenship, i.e. Asians, but the law was targeting really the Japanese, from owning land, is profound. This conflict highlighted the disconnect not only between state and national priorities, but also between rural and urban Californians as the anti-Japanese movement spread from its origins in San Francisco to the rural areas of the state. Fair officials insisted that the fair would fail without the participation of Japan and China. So this was the Panama-Pacific International Exposition. One of the selling points was that the nations of China and Japan would be there, representing untapped markets for American businessmen and others to advertise to. They were also there as, to exhibit to curious visitors and tourists. So fair officials believed it was absolutely essential that both nations committed to participating in the fair, and that shaped the approach that they took with their negotiations with both local and international figures. But both officials and local residents of both Chinese and Japanese descent were wary of committing to participate in a fair in a state that treated its Asian residents with such contempt. And the state's anti-Asian politics did threaten the fair at multiple moments before it opened. When in 1911, anti-Japanese agitation in California threatened the renegotiation of the commercial treaty between the two nations, some national legislators threatened to deny San Francisco the right to hold the fair. And in 1913, when the state legislature passed the alien land laws for the second time, the first time the governor vetoed it, the second time he ends up not, but before the votes and everything, exposition officials kicked into high gear to try to campaign against the alien land laws because they believed that the passage of the land laws would threaten the success of the fair. They testified in Sacramento, arguing that the Japanese and Chinese governments would be much too offended to commit the funds to come to the fair if these laws passed. The laws did pass. Governor Johnson signed it nevertheless, which he had vetoed the first time. That is a subject of lots of speculation as to the exact reasons why. This forced fair officials to do their best to convince officials of both China and Japan that they would be welcomed and respected at the fair. Local ethnically Chinese and Japanese residents, like their respective national diplomats, also were very interested in participating in the fair because they hoped that the fair could improve the status of their residents in California and boost their nation's worldwide reputations. The founding of the Chinese Republic in 1912 is an important fact to keep in your head because this stimulated nationalist sentiment among overseas Chinese, and they were eager to support China's efforts to prove itself a strong nation. And the PPIE would prove to be the first international exposition at which China was able to stage its own exhibit without the oversight of the British. So they had been at earlier fairs, but their displays had been being overseen by the British. The editor of the San Francisco paper Young China, translated, urged, quote, "At the Panama Exposition, we must devote all our energy to it so that Americans will know the reality of our national power." The local Chinese Western Daily emphasized how important the fair could be to the development of China, since overseas Chinese could learn much to, quote, "push forward Chinese culture and civilization." Others, on a more practical note, urged that city residents seize the chance to improve Chinatown's image and its status by cleaning up Chinatown so as to impress visitors with Chinatown's fame, and they wanted to raise funds for electric lights to make it on par with, quote, Western neighborhoods. Japanese officials, after years of witnessing the growing anti-Japanese movement in California, Japanese officials were equally wary of committing to the fair, but also hoped that an impressive exhibit could help improve the situation for Japanese residents of California. Local Japanese residents voiced similar sentiments. A 1912 editorial in the city's Japanese American News noted, quote, "The fair was an ideal opportunity and a rare chance to combat the anti-Japanese movement. If fair officials unified in their welcoming of Japan, that would send an important message to inspire others in the general public to see the Japanese more positively." And as you can see, this is the groundbreaking for the Japanese pavilion at the fair. And this is a representation. This is the public that turned out, primarily Japanese residents of the Bay Area, who turned out to celebrate and support the groundbreaking of the building at the fair. So the fair stimulated all kinds of celebrations even before it happened. There were lots of, many of the buildings had celebrations around the groundbreaking. So despite the debates over the land laws, a proposed immigration bill in Congress, and a crackdown on enforcing some objectionable immigration laws, all of which strained Chinese and Japanese support for the fair, by 1915, both nations and their California residents had chosen to throw their support behind the fair. Both nations ended up crafting modern progressive identities for themselves at the fair through their large national buildings and by contributing exhibits to the larger fair on their modernized education and transportation systems. So nations could exhibit both in their own pavilion, like the Japanese pavilion, and then also they might have exhibits in the Palace of Education where they were showing the Japanese or the Chinese education system. So Japan actually contributed the largest single, like they were the nation to contribute the largest number of exhibits to the fair. This is the Chinese building at the fair, at the PPIE, or the Chinese sort of compound. It's not just one building, but this is the Chinese building. Let's see, people for scale. And then these are some samples of Japan's contribution to the fair as well. This is one scene of the gardens and part of the pavilion. This is the tea house, and that is like a diorama. I think it's the Nikko shrines that were in. I think it was in the Japanese pavilion. Okay, so both Japan and China also participated in celebrations of Japan Day and China Day, just like the Sweden Day that I showed you before. But their approach to these celebrations differed a bit. When ethnic Chinese visitors celebrated China Day and Chinese Students Day at the exposition, they downplayed traditional aspects of Chinese culture, and instead of the speeches, the rhetoric, the imagery focused on China's relationship to the United States and its recent technological advances. Because I argue that in the Chinese context, the pageantry that other nations displayed, praising their heritage, evoked anti-Asian sentiments and stereotypes. So the Chinese appear to have avoided drawing attention to their history in those events, and instead tried to insert themselves into the spectacle of the fair as westernized, modern citizens of the Chinese Republic or of the United States, rather than symbols of an alien yellow peril, as it was so often referred to. And the Chinese approach to these celebrations makes sense when we place it in the context of a conflict that emerged in the early days of the fair. This is a shot of the zone, the midway on the fair. And unfortunately for Bay Area Chinese who hoped that the fair would reveal a strong and vibrant China, when the fair opened, the Chinese national exhibit was half finished, which proved very embarrassing to many local Chinese residents. And more disturbing was the exhibit Underground Chinatown, which was a part of the, excuse me, this Chinese village on the zone, which was not the same as the Chinese National, right? So the Chinese National exhibit was in its own building. This was aimed at entertainment. It was on the entertainment section of the zone. It had, you see, there's chop suey, there's a Chinese theater, and it included a section called Underground Chinatown. And you can see the entrance right there. I don't know anybody who's been able to find a picture of what was actually inside Underground Chinatown, though we do have descriptions. Many of the attractions on the Midway, the zone, like at other fairs, included non-white people living in their, quote, traditional villages, which is a topic in and of itself that is important to discuss. Underground Chinatown took a somewhat similar approach, sort of in some ways, by ostensibly representing Chinese life in the United States by plunging visitors into a recreation of the supposed underground warrens of San Francisco's Chinatown, where prostitutes and opium addicts plied their trade. Although such a place really existed only in the white imagination, stories of underground Chinatown circulated widely in 19th and early 20th century San Francisco. So members of the Chinese community and allies immediately voiced their displeasure with this demeaning attraction. Their language revealed their hopes for the fair. The Chinese 6 companies appealed to President Moore of the fair, quote, to end this outrageous travesty of the Chinese people. They voiced their frustration about the concession that drew the racial line between white and Chinese more strongly, rather than easing it. In mid-March, Chinese merchants, ministers, and student leaders, as well as white missionaries who worked in Chinatown, all wrote to Moore, deploring underground Chinatown. They argued that the attraction portrayed a false image of the Chinese and did a serious injustice to a valuable segment of the San Francisco community. The tenor of these complaints revealed that local Chinese residents recognized the power of the fair and of attractions like Underground Chinatown to mark them as racial others who threatened white American moral standards. It confirmed their fears beforehand about the exposition that it might strengthen anti-Chinese sentiment. They resented the perpetuation of old stereotypes of San Francisco in an event that was supposed to showcase the city. A group of Chinese ministers and elders noted, quote, the exhibitions are deliberate falsehood, libel and slander, and a disgrace to the Chinese race, for they are sheer fabrication from the imagination of the promoters in order to make some dirty profit. Despite the flood of complaints, it took a while for the fair to respond. Only after Chen Qi, the official Chinese commissioner from the nation of China to the fair, stated, in stark terms, his governor's displeasure with the attraction and with the exposition's failure to address the complaint, which he had lodged 3 weeks before. Only after they hear from the commissioner does the fair decide to take action. Chen noted at Timor, he said, "Is it fair to our many law-abiding and moral Chinese residents that these unwise deeds and acts of perchance some immoral Chinese residents should be flaunted before the world?" Despite these forceful objections and the flood of other letters, the PPIE Committee on Concessions and Admissions, which was the committee in charge of concessions and admissions, only closed the attraction when President Moore directed it, like basically said, you have to do this, apparently realizing the damage that the attraction could do to the exposition and the nation's relationship with China. However, the story isn't done quite yet. The concession reopened, and some of you may know this story. It's been told a number of places. The concession reopened as underground slumming in early June. Fair officials reassured the concerned Chinese community that it had dispensed with all offensive features. The San Francisco Chronicle reported that the new attraction was completely changed since it had refocused on the evils of the drug trade, with, quote, nearly a mile of underground passages wherein there are over 100 figures showing the destroying effects of various prohibited drugs. However, for the not so astute reader, it remained closely associated with Chinatown. An ad in the Call, San Francisco Call, read, quote, "On the zone, underground slumming, formerly underground Chinatown." More impressive than any book or sermon. So needless to say, changing Chinatown to slumming did nothing to remove the association with the Chinese, since slumming was the practice that a popular practice of white men and women to visit Chinatown in search, among other racialized neighborhoods in other cities, right, to view the supposedly salacious lifestyles contained therein. And of course, the reference to any play, book, or sermon is a suggestion that any potential viewer is going to find it far more entertaining than something more educational. Underground Chinatown revealed that the local Chinese community was correct to be wary of the exposition. Although Chinese San Franciscans succeeded in closing the attraction, as long as underground slumming existed on the zone, it provided a powerful foil to the official Chinese exhibit at the fair. To visitors familiar with racialized depictions of Chinese residents, of opium-addicted Chinese prostitutes and gamblers, according to stereotypes, this new attraction only affirmed those stereotypes that that the official Chinese exhibit was hard-pressed to counter. Yet Chinese Americans continue to participate in events held at the fair, claiming the space of the exposition and including themselves in the public discourse surrounding the fair. One of the other characteristics of the fair that's important to understand is there were what's the number? 938? I don't know if that's quite right. Congresses and conventions that were scheduled in San Francisco or Oakland in conjunction with the fair that were held throughout the 9 months that the fair was open. And some of those, most of those had some events on the fairgrounds and then sometimes had meetings at other places around the city. The Chinese Nationalist League of America, the Chinese Students Alliance in the United States, the International Buddhist Congress, the Chinese Students Christian Association of North America, and the Asiatic Students Alliance all met on the grounds during the late summer of 1915. In October, the United Parlor of the Sons of the Golden State, not Golden West, which was a newly formed group composed of second-generation Chinese San Franciscans, assembled on the grounds as well. The use of the grounds as a meeting place for local and national Chinese residents and immigrants presented a dramatically different vision of the Chinese in California society than did underground Chinatown. This is China Day. I wish this tree was not there, but this is in the book, and I'm like, the darn tree. But anyway, this is a celebration of China Day. As you can see, you know, it's well attended, but there are no visual elements that are at all sort of Asian, evoke any kind of Asian culture, which is quite different than the way that the Japanese tended to approach some of their celebrations. So this is Chinese Students' Day. The visual of these students lining up for a photograph on Chinese Students' Day offer rebuttal to the racialized vision of the Chinese that appeared in underground Chinatown. And this is just one excerpt If anybody has this book, Chin's Bridging the Pacific, this is the whole book cover, and it's like it opens the flaps. If that makes any sense. So this is like one piece of it that I scanned. I think the original piece is somewhere else, but you can see that these are Chinese students who are appearing in, westernized apparel, and mostly male, but there's some female students as well. Japanese, however, took a somewhat different approach, and instead it tended to use the fair to show off their nation's westernization and progress, in their terms, and its history and culture. The Japanese Commission sponsored many Japanese cultural celebrations at the fairgrounds, including celebration of the New Year, a doll festival, and an Irish festival. These are some of the celebrations from Event Day, which obviously included wrestling. And these are some of the participants. Those are other participants from some of the events of Japan Day. There was also a large, I think this is a float from the parade for Japan Day, that included far more traditional Japanese elements in their displays than the Chinese did in theirs. Other ethnic groups were also, besides the Asians, were concerned about their participation and depiction on the fairgrounds. One of the more unexpected for us today, perhaps, might be the case of the Irish. Earlier expositions had included Irish villages on their midways that presented negative stereotypes of the Irish. Certainly less anti-Irish and anti-Catholic sentiment existed in San Francisco than in many other parts of the country, but the San Francisco Irish were still concerned that the fair might include some of these potential exhibits. Moreover, those who supported Irish independence, this is 1915, really wanted Ireland to send its own exhibit. This is before the war starts. So they were hoping the fair might offer a space to assert their goal for an independent Ireland, in a very interesting kind of anti-colonial statement. Prominent local Irishmen formed the Celtic Society of the Panama-Pacific International Exposition to meet with fair directors to discuss Irish participation. And they wanted the fair to solicit an independent Irish exhibit. And they wanted it to show quote, show the world that in every department of human endeavor, Ireland can stand with the best. They hoped that highlighting Ireland's economic success would dispel visions of a pre-industrial backward nation that still circulated in some parts of the United States. To their disappointment, the plan failed. Ireland did not send an official exhibit, probably because by 1915, it was clear that participating in an international exposition during wartime was not possible. Thus, the only Irish exhibit was the Shamrock Isle. This is the Shamrock Isle. The concessionaires who funded it solicited support from Irish both in Ireland and San Francisco. And the fair directors actually made an effort to get it approved by prominent Irishmen in San Francisco, right? There's a lot of wealthy, prominent, the bishop, the archbishop, right? With Catholic mayors, the Irish were very prominent and important in San Francisco. Nonetheless, the proposed attraction still attracted controversy. Radical labor leader, Father Peter York, the editor of The Leader, the weekly Irish Catholic paper in San Francisco, warned that those behind the concession were, quote, were planning something, quote, on the same level as the concession for the hairy Hottentots or the blubbery Eskimo, and on par with the, quote, miserable exhibitions at Chicago and St. Louis. However, the Monitor, which was the pro-Irish paper of the Catholic diocese, published a much more positive review and interview with the concessionaire, in which he promised that the village would feature an array of enormous old castles, round towers, and ivy-covered ruins. A row of characteristic cottages of various sizes and colors, each a picture itself, a sturdy Irish boy, and behind him, two rosy-cheeked colleens come riding merrily along in a donkey cart. So that version, which I believe is pretty much very similar to what actually occurred, drew on a very, very romanticized vision of Ireland that reduced Irish citizens to either inhabitants of magnificent castles and charming cottages, and obscured the reality of Irish struggles with industrialization, poverty, and independence. For anyone who hoped that an Irish exhibit would highlight Ireland's modernity and economic success. These plans for the Shamrock Isle must certainly have been a disappointment. Now, the attraction closed after only a few months, which was not uncommon. A lot of the things on the zone opened and closed kind of pretty regularly, but the Shamrock Isle did not do very well. And the official fair historian, Frank Morton Todd, remarked, "The public did not seem especially interested in Irish singing and clog dancing, at least not enough of the public to make it pay." His offhand remark suggests one of the reasons why the Shamrock Isle never generated the same kind of attention, positive or negative, as underground Chinatown. The image it presented did not carry the same kind of racial power as did underground Chinatown and depictions of Asians in heavily Irish San Francisco. So another controversy emerged when the Irish got very upset. Well, when the editor of the Monitor, the Catholic diocesan paper, got very angry with a sculptor of the Nations of the West, which was a very prominent statuary group that stood upon one of the arches in the Court of the Universe and depicted the people who had shaped the United States. So that's what this statuary group is supposed to have done. And the editor charged that the piece ignored the Irish, and the Irish had been instrumental in forming the nation. In response, the fair officials actually forwarded the response to the artist and made the artist respond to the paper, which indicates something about how significant they saw it. He informed the paper that the Anglo-Saxon figure was intended to be, quote, one collective representative of the whole British idea, which included the Irish. Moreover, he claimed that Celtic ideals inspired his composition of the Mother of Tomorrow, who I believe is in the center there. His reply, however, did not appease the Monitor, which termed it, quote, alas, very lame. The matter ended there, but the point was made. The San Francisco Irish demanded representation on the grounds. Now, that complaint might seem trivial, but it demonstrated the power of Irish Catholics in San Francisco, because officials worried enough about it to ask the artist to respond to the diocese, to the bishop or the editor about his concern. They did not want to risk offending either the archdiocese, led by Irishman Archbishop Hanna, or the Building Trades Union, led by Irishman former mayor and exposition director Patrick McCarthy. So I only have a few more minutes, so I'm going to go fairly quickly through a couple of things here. Needless to say, some groups had no traction with the fair. One of the groups that had very little traction, if any traction really, with the fair was the local African-American community. Black San Franciscans attempted to communicate with the fair, tried to coordinate participation in the fair, but they were more often rebuffed or ignored, in a stark contrast to the treatment that was accorded to Chinese, Japanese, Irish, or any of the European nations. This meant that attractions like this existed on the zone. As early as 1911, Black Californians petitioned fair officials to organize a display featuring African-American achievements. There was no response. The only existing evidence that I could find of discussion between the fair and Black leaders is a letter from W.E.B. Du Bois, in which he refers to discussions held with fair officials during 1913, when they decided that, quote, a special Negro department was unwise. In 1914, he proposed the staging of an impressive pageant and celebration of Black culture and history to music director George Stewart, but no evidence exists as to whether Du Bois pursued it after Stewart told him it was out of his purview. Despite that, members of the Black community around the Bay Area continued to support the fair, and I argue saw the fair as a space from which they could voice their civic pride and assert their citizenship. So they worked to accommodate visiting African Americans so that they could find places to live, to visit, to stay, so they would not face discrimination. And they also coordinated the participation of the Black community in the celebration of both San Francisco Day and Alameda County Day at the fair. So they put floats together that appeared in both of those parades. And the local Black newspapers praised them highly, but I could find no evidence that the white papers mentioned them at all. They also took advantage of the meeting times to stage meetings. This is the California State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, which met in the summer of 1915. This is a photograph of the attendees. They met in Oakland, but it was associated with the fair, and they did have some events on the grounds as well. So these are some of the stories. I'll give myself 5 minutes here. That appear in my book that I use to talk about the influence of the local politics and local circumstances on the fair itself, to dig more deeply into the participation of local communities in the fair and the significance of the fair for the Bay Area. And I'm happy to talk more about any of those things. But I want to talk a little bit now about the connections that I've been thinking about in terms of the 1915 fair and the 1939 Golden Gate International Exposition. The PPIE is much better known, I think. Even in the Bay Area, I think it's much better known. The GGIE, also called the Treasure Island Fair, it occurred on Treasure Island. Treasure Island was created in part to host the fair. It occurred in San Francisco Bay, but was technically hosted in conjunction with all of the counties that touch the bay. So I can't remember the total number, but there's a large number of counties. So San Mateo and Sonoma and Marin, all the counties that touch the bay were also hosts for the fair. This time, the fair celebrated the completion of the Golden Gate and Bay Bridges. And this time, federal money underwrote much of the fair, most obviously through the WPA workers whose labor built the fair. And as I thought about the connections between the two events, it occurred to me that in many ways, the way that they were created represents a great deal about San Francisco's changing status in the nation by 1939. This time, so federal money underwrote the fair. Connections to power brokers in Washington helped bring the fair and federal dollars necessary to stage it to the city, reflecting the city's national influence. It was not necessary in 1939 for fair boosters to stage a national postcard campaign, which they did, to convince Congress to award them the fair. Instead, a few meetings in Washington helped seal the deal and brought over $7 million of New Deal funds to the project. But the success of the PPIE did inspire those who supported the Treasure Island Fair. So some who were involved in the PPIE contributed to the planning for the GGIE. The architecture, however, was radically different. It was a new style of Pacific architecture, which did not ever catch on. It has been described as long, horizontally pyramided lines characteristic of Malayan, Incan, and Cambodian monuments, and reminiscent of the high walls of a storybook city. It has been less charitably described as gaudy, eclectic, and exceedingly uninteresting. Most significantly, although the fair celebrated American influence in the Pacific, the spread of ideas of cultural relativism and an anthropological appreciation of cultural differences produced a very different Pacific world for visitors than it had in 1915. So here's a map. You can see it's laid out very differently than the PPIE. So the theme of the fair was the pageant of the Pacific. It was also often described as the World's Fair of the West or California's World's Fair. The fair intentionally cultivated a regional Western identity that linked the Western United States to the broader Pacific. Boosters claimed that the fair would foster, quote, Pacific unity, linking nations together by speeding transportation, increasing understanding between the races, and knitting the Pacific Empire into a closer and more effective web for concerted effort. So unlike the PPIE, in which organizers were trying to prove that San Francisco was an American place, was a safe place for people to come and visit, by the GGIE, the city is very much identifying as a Western place, and Western no longer has the connotations have changed somewhat. And there was no need to assert San Francisco's claim to be part of the United States. That was obvious. Instead, they were claiming a Western and Pacific identity. So there's a lot more I could tell you. One of the most interesting things I think is that the theme building of the fair is called Pacific House. And these maps some of you may have seen. I do too. I am missing one. I have 5 of the 6. And yes, so these were, there are 6 of these maps. They were on the walls of Pacific House. Miguel Covarrubias painted them. I love them because they totally changed our geographical perceptions, right? They challenged visitors who walked into Pacific House to think of themselves as living in a world in which the Pacific is the center rather than the Atlantic. This is the first, as what I came across in the archives is this is the first projection. It was created by cartographers at Berkeley. This is the first projection of the world that put the Pacific at the center. So statuary is quite different as well. Very 1930s. Also, we're seeing concrete people doing things rather than abstract ideas. Rather than statuary that expresses abstract ideas, which was much more similar in the 1910s. Finally, I was going to say that I'm totally out of time.
Keep going.
Yes.
So, okay, I'll be quick. So these are some of this is some of the statuary that is fairly typical. This is Pacifica, which was like the theme statue of the fair. And I love this picture because it has these bathing beauties. There was an aquacade, and Esther Williams and Johnny Weissmuller were both there. And they were posing. So that also gets into, there are lots of half-naked women all over the fair as well, including Sally Rand's nude ranch. And then there are cute Chinese children. So this is a contest for the cutest Chinese boy that was staged, in the Chinese village. Because underlying the 1939 fair was the minor problem of a war raging in Asia as a result of, the Japanese had invaded China. World War II had essentially already begun in the Pacific. It starts in Europe in September, and that absolutely translates to the fairgrounds in certain ways as well. The last piece I was going to talk about was thinking about the ways in which digitization has changed my ability to research these topics. I hunched over a microfilm reader when I was doing my dissertation, and now I can keyword search newspapers. Now, I don't think everybody should just keyword search. I tell my students that, right? But the availability of resources is tremendous, which can be incredibly overwhelming. And I haven't quite figured out how to solve that one yet, but also amazing. So these sources come from the Densho digital repository. If anybody's familiar with that, it is an amazing collection of resources related to Japanese American incarceration. And it is amazing. And the point of it is to put all of this material online for people to use and for people to be able to understand about their family's experiences. And this woman, Clara Sasaki, or Hattori was her married name, worked at the fair. She worked in the Japanese pavilion, and she kept an amazing scrapbook, and she labeled it. And this is her badge. These are the workers, and then she's in the middle with 2 of her friends. The digitization of newspapers, the digitization of the Japanese with English language sections, I don't read Japanese, from Stanford means that I've been able to look up the names of these people and find out about them, like who they were and where they went to high school and what their activities were, because newspapers publish a lot of news about daily things, which is a lot, used to, has allowed me to delve in really different ways into the fair, which is why I have yet to finish the book. But yeah, so anyway, thank you for listening. I hope you all have some questions. Thank you.
I brought you some more water
Thank you.
for doing such a great job projecting.
Okay, thank you. I have a little bit down here. So
Let me stop this screen share, and then we're going to start by taking some questions here in the audience. And now everybody on Zoom can see you. That's what,
Oh,
that's
okay.
what you look like. Nice and bright. And Jake is going to turn the lights on, the middle light, and then the slider. Yeah, turn that. That's good. And now the slider goes up. That's it.
Excellent.
Now everybody can see you. So let's start with some questions
Okay.
here. We're going to start in the front, and then we'll go in the back.
Okay.
What happened to all the statuary in both of the fairs?
Some of it was destroyed, some of it was sold off.
So sorry.
Okay. Some of it was preserved. But some of it wasn't. I mean, and I know there are people there are catalogs where you can try and find out where all the different pieces have gone. Do you know, were you gonna?
Just another question.
Yeah, so some of them were preserved, but a lot of them weren't.
Yeah, I recently learned that Fillmore had metal arches constructed so that would be the official entrance to Pan-Pacific Exposition.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And thus that metal was torn down during World War II to use for.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, we have a similar question on Zoom about all of the buildings.
They were all,
Well, I think the answer quick, they were all
they're all
destroyed.
gone.
They're all gone. Well,
A
but
couple of
why?
them.
Like, what was
oh,
the driving?
it was built, the development of the marina.
That-
I mean, but
let's just
basically,
say
yeah.
what it is.
So, yeah, well, yeah, that's the end of the book, right? So it was always designed to be temporary, right? So the fair was always built to be temporary. The constructions were not permanent. I mean, obviously the fine arts, Palace of Fine Arts still exists, though actually it's been rebuilt, right?
It's 1971.
So it is a rebuilt, but that's the only remaining piece. The rest of it was sold off and the Marina District emerged out of it. So it was always about development, right? I mean, they kicked everybody out also, the people that lived there, which I talk about. Like there was a neighborhood there, Harbor View, where there were people that lived there and they kicked them all out. And then they added more land because they put fill in to expand the site. But it was never intended that things were going to stay. I mean, there were periodic, as people started to want to preserve parts of it, but they weren't very, one of them, they sailed down the bay somewhere. I want to say it's the Oregon building.
We'll go Tina in the back. She was next.
Thank you. I was curious, you said that the federal government came in and funded this particular fair a lot more than any other.
In 39, they did.
In 39, and but did that have any, that coincide with their idea of making it to a military base?
It
That in the back of their mind from the very beginning.
So
It was supposed to be
let's
the
recap the question because I'm not sure people on Zoom.
Okay.
Hear this.
So she was asking about the relationship between the federal money that was put toward the fair and the fact that Treasure Island was turned into a Navy base, right? Whether that was part of the original plan. It was supposed to become the airport. SFO was supposed to be on Treasure Island, right? So that was the plan. And obviously, I mean, Yerba Buena was already a Navy base. Like there were Navy barracks. No, Yerba Buena, the little island. I mean, obviously Mare Island too, but yeah, what? Yeah,
Coast Guard, I think.
yeah. I mean, I don't know. Well, I have actually the historic structure report of that, so I could look it up. But yeah, no, there were Navy barracks on Yerba Buena already, which is the other side. And then, I mean, the plan was the airport.
Maybe that's why more federal funding.
I mean, yes, I think that was part of it, though. I mean, there were a series of Depression era fairs that were held. There's Chicago, San Diego,
New York.
well, New York, obviously, at the same time. There's another one before that too, but and the WPA funds and federal funds were used for a number of those fairs, right, as ways to stimulate provide jobs. But yeah, that's a good question.
Okay, we're just gonna take a couple more questions, so we're gonna go over here first and then here.
Yeah, I worked in the Palace of Fine Arts when the Exploratorium was young
Oh, okay.
for Frank Oppenheimer. So I've read a lot and have some books about the Palace of Fine Arts and its rebuilding in permanent materials out of the sort of paper mache that they.
Right, travertine or something.
My
Yeah.
big question is about the Pan-Pacific Exposition. What about Russia? Did we hear from them? Russia was enormous and.
They were in the middle of a massive war, right? I mean,
War with Japan.
right, but doesn't the revolution start? I mean, 1917 is the Bolshevik Revolution,
Yeah.
but isn't there? I mean,
Lots of
it's been a long time since I've studied Russian history, but I don't think Russia was in any condition. That it's a really interesting question. Now the Soviets send an exhibit to the 39 New York Fair, right? Which I didn't mention because I was talking super fast. What? No, it's the same year. So there's one in San Francisco in 39, and then there's one in New York, and New York is much better known.
Someone asked about that, about confirming that, was it 39
Yes,
for New
it
York?
was.
And the answer is yes. So we're gonna do one, okay, we're running out of time, but I know that we'll do one more question here and then I'm gonna ask a question that's on Zoom. Go ahead.
Well, it's ironic that the one building survived from the PPIE was built as a ruin. And I've always thought that it was ironic, maybe subversive, that Maybeck terminated the western axis of that imperial fair
Mhm.
with a Roman ruin. And I don't know whether he was conscious.
It's a good question.
But that's why it is actually so compelling
Right.
that people don't know. It's actually about death. And so it's an extremely powerful
Mhm.
building in that sense.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question.
Okay, we are gonna take your question. I lied.
Yeah, okay, then I read recently that there was also some controversy about having part of the 1915 fair in Southern California.
Oh, there were two separate fairs.
And was that a separate fair or?
There were two separate fairs. It was part of the compromise about where there were people who wanted a fair in Southern California, there were people who wanted a fair in Northern California. The compromise that there was the Panama-California Exposition in San Diego, and there was the Panama-Pacific, which was in San Francisco. Technically, the San Francisco one was the official international exposition. But the Panama-California was also an important fair, and they coordinated a fair amount of advertising together. Like the railroads, of course, tried to convince you to come to California and see both fairs. And Balboa Park comes from that fair, so it in some way it's much better preserved than here. And they were able to stage the 35 fair in the same space, I think. So there was a fair in 35 in San Diego as well. So did that clarify? Yeah.
There are a couple of questions on Zoom about San Diego and the coordination and how they might have competed and even coordinated together. And I'm gonna send those to you so you don't have to answer them today. Because we're out of time,
Okay.
but there is a burning question. I've got a couple of them on Zoom and one or two people here in the room have asked. If you can tell us, if you know what the dip refers to in Africa dip. Like a lot of people are wondering.
I do not know. I don't know. I'm not sure.
Oh, now we all have to find out.
I know. It's possible that Laura Ackley mentions it and has more specifics on it in her book. I mean, she went into a lot of the specifics of, a lot of details around certain parts of the fair that I don't focus on as much because of the angle that I was taking. So it's possible that she may have found out more about the African dip than I did.
People are very curious to
Because
know.
I was curious as well, and if anybody finds out, I would like to.
I'm not gonna say a word.
It's a secret. We can't share it.
I mean, there were all kinds of things, there's bowls of joy in which people died because they flew off of the roller coaster.
Oh, yeah. That's for
Fourth
another.
graders really like to hear that
That's
story.
I can imagine. I'm a fourth grader, I guess. So let's have a big round of applause for our speaker. Thank you. Such a trooper and a champion dealing with our sound issues. We do need to reboot the modem for our sound, and guess where it is? Right.
I'm right, okay,
So-
moving now.
So we couldn't do that before, and we.
I
had to
now
do
see the
something.
problem.
So thank you again to our speaker this evening, Abigail Markwyn,
Thank you all for coming, I really appreciate it. Hi, Terry.
and thanks for attending,
What?
everyone.
I did not bring copies,
Yeah.
but it's on Amazon. I mean, it's available. They printed it in hardback it came out in hardback and then they put it in paper. So it is available.
It's available
bring
at your
copies,
local
though.
bookstore
I
as
hope at
well,
your local book, I mean,
and
at least
on
order
Amazon.
it through your local bookstore.
or bookstore.com.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
bookshop.org.
Bookshop.org.
Yeah.
Our next program is a week from tonight, Monday, June 18th at 6 p.m. The title is June 18th. Wow, I have jumped ahead. I'm just reading now. Monday, March 18th. That is a week from now. The title is Redemptive Dreams, Engaging Kevin Starr's California. And it's an in-person and virtual presentation by author and professor of sociology from the University of California, Los Angeles, Jason S. Sexton. And you can register for that program by going online to bccbooks.org/programs, or you can respond to any of the emails that you might be getting from the Book Club of California. So thanks everyone for joining us and dealing with our technical difficulties. I hope you enjoyed tonight's program, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.